The air in Aurelia was not merely air. It was a curated atmosphere, heavy with the scent of old money, white truffles, and the faint floral perfume of women who had never known a moment of hardship. It was an environment thick enough to be measured in carats and thread counts, a gilded sanctuary where conversations were conducted in hushed conspiratorial tones that barely disturbed the gentle symphony of silver cutlery meeting fine porcelain. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, fracturing into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced across the damask-covered walls and the polished marble floor, creating the illusion of a sky filled with frozen constellations. Each table was an island of power, a stage where fortunes were decided, and dynasties were forged over plates of food that were more art than sustenance. The silence between courses was a testament to the restaurant's exclusivity, a profound quietude that spoke of absolute control, a world so insulated from the chaos of the city outside that its patrons could believe they were immune to the laws of gravity, of time, of consequence. Here, wealth was not just displayed, it was performed. A grand, silent opera of entitlement, where the staff were the unseen stagehands, ensuring the flawless execution of a spectacle they could never hope to join. Ilara Vance moved through this opulent theater with the practiced grace of a phantom, her black uniform a deliberate void against the room's gilded splendor. Her movements were economical, precise, a ballet of efficiency honed over hundreds of shifts. She could refill a water glass without a ripple, clear a plate without a sound, her presence so unobtrusive that she became part of the background, as easily ignored as the intricate patterns in the wallpaper. But this invisibility was a carefully constructed armor. Beneath the starched collar and the placid, professional expression, a universe of memory and grief churned in a silent, relentless storm. Every smile she offered was a shield. Every polite nod, a carefully fortified wall. Inside her mind was a gallery of images, a library of texts she could recall with perfect, painful clarity. She wasn't just a waitress, she was a scholar in exile, a historian of beauty forced to serve men who saw none of it. Her brilliant mind a caged bird beating its wings against the bars of her circumstance, waiting for a moment, any moment, to be set free. Her heart beat a steady, defiant rhythm, a drumbeat of purpose that no amount of condescension could silence. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. Not so long ago, Ilara's world had been one of sunlit university archives and the hallowed halls of academia, a life measured in the rustle of ancient manuscripts and the scent of aging paper. She had been a prodigy, a PhD candidate in art history whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and envy. Her specialization was provenance, the intricate journey of an art piece through history, and her mind was uniquely suited for it. She was gifted with a flawless eidetic memory, an ability to see an image once and hold it in her mind's eye forever, perfect in every detail, every brushstroke, every faded pencil line. It was her gift, her passion, her entire future. She saw the world not as a series of moments, but as a collection of canvases, each one imprinted upon her memory with unwavering fidelity. Her professors spoke of a brilliant career, of museum directorships and groundbreaking publications. She was on a trajectory aimed at the very stars, poised to leave her mark on the world she so deeply loved, a world of truth and beauty that felt a million miles away from the clinking glasses and empty laughter of Aurelia. That world had shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, not with a bang, but with the sterile, terrifying silence of a hospital waiting room. Her father, Daniel Vance, a kind and brilliant architect whose hands could shape concrete and steel into structures that seemed to sing, had suffered a catastrophic stroke. The cause was not a mystery. It was a collapse born of financial ruin and the brutal public humiliation of losing his small ethical firm in a hostile takeover. The man who had taught her to see the beauty in a perfect line, the integrity in a well-designed structure, was now trapped within his own body, his brilliant mind clouded by a fog of pain and confusion. Ilara had traded her academic robes for a waitress's apron without a second thought, abandoning her future to pay for his. The crushing weight of his 24/7 medical care was the reason she endured the long nights, the aching feet, and the casual cruelty of the wealthy. Her motivation was not simply survival, it was a fierce, protective love, a burning need to restore the dignity that had been stolen from the man who was her entire world. The hushed reverence of the restaurant fractured the moment Marcus Thorne arrived. He did not walk into Aurelia, he conquered it. The air itself seemed to part for him, the ambient chatter dipping as if in deference to his presence. He was a man carved from ambition and disdain. His tailored suit a piece of dark armor, his watch a glint of cold financial power on his wrist. He moved with an apex predator's assurance, his eyes sweeping the room not with appreciation, but with assessment, cataloging the net worth of its occupants and finding them all wanting. The manager, a man who intimidated senators, scurried to his side, his posture one of fawning subservience. Thorne was the CEO of Thorne Capital, a private equity firm known for its predatory tactics, a corporate titan who devoured smaller companies and left ruined lives in his wake. He saw people not as human beings but as assets or liabilities, and the service staff, to him, were less than nothing. They were invisible, extensions of the furniture, and he treated them with a contempt so profound it was almost casual, the way one might swat away an insect without a thought. Ilara was assigned to his table. As she approached, she fortified the walls of her composure, her face becoming a mask of professional neutrality. Thorne was deep in conversation with the younger, sycophantic associate, his voice a low growl of satisfaction as he recounted the details of his latest corporate conquest. He was celebrating an acquisition, a victory that had undoubtedly destroyed another small company, another family like hers. The words he used, leverage, liquidation, restructuring, were the same sterile euphemisms that had appeared on the documents that ruined her father. She poured his wine, a vintage that cost more than her monthly rent, her hand impossibly steady. He didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge her existence beyond the function she performed. To Marcus Thorne, she was not Ilara Vance, a daughter, a scholar. She was merely a pair of hands, there to fill his glass and clear his plate while he carved up the world. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, caged thing, but her breathing remained even, her movements fluid and controlled. The meal progressed as a masterclass in arrogance. Thorne held court, his laughter sharp and humorless, his gestures grand and dismissive. He spoke of his own genius, his infallible vision, his utter contempt for the weakness of his competitors. Every word was a small, sharp stone pelting the fragile shield of Ilara's self-control. She felt the ghost of her father at her side, remembering his quiet integrity, his belief in building things that would last, things that would serve people. Thorne believed only in acquisition, in dominance, in tearing things down for profit. The contrast was a physical pain, a burning in her chest that grew hotter with each passing moment. She felt a cold, crystalline fury solidifying in her veins, a rage so pure it was almost calm. She focused on the task at hand, on the placement of a fork, the angle of a wine glass, using the mundane details of her job as an anchor in the rising tide of her anger, keeping the storm locked away behind her eyes. The incident, when it came, was almost laughably small. As Ilara reached to refill his water glass, a slight, almost imperceptible jostle from a passing busboy caused her hand to twitch. A single perfect drop of water escaped the pitcher and landed on the edge of a stack of documents Thorne had placed on the table. It was nothing. A tiny, glistening bead of moisture that would evaporate in seconds. But Thorne's eyes locked onto it as if it were a mortal wound. His face, which had been flushed with self-congratulation, twisted into a mask of theatrical fury. He turned to his guest. See? This is what I'm talking about. Incompetence. You can't escape it. He then fixed his gaze on Alara, his voice dripping with venom. Are you incapable of performing even the simplest task? Do you have any idea what these papers are worth? They're worth more than your entire, pathetic life. The insult hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. In Alara's mind, the opulent restaurant dissolved, replaced by the stark, white image of her father's hospital room, his vacant eyes. The ruin Thorne's world had wrought upon hers. The final act of humiliation was swift and brutal. Thorne's rage was not spent, it was merely searching for a grander gesture. He sneered, a cruel, vicious twist of his lips. He wanted to make an example of her, to demonstrate the unbridgeable chasm between his world and hers. He reached into his jacket not for a pen, but for his wallet. It was a thick, expensive thing, crafted from fine, dark leather. He didn't open it to pull out a few bills. He held the entire thing between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were something distasteful. Then, in a gesture of ultimate contempt, he tossed it onto the floor at her feet. It landed with a soft, sickening thud on the cold marble. Here, he spat, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Take the whole thing. Maybe you can buy yourself a future. A wave of shocked silence rippled through the dining room. Alara stood frozen, the blood roaring in her ears. The wallet lay there, a symbol of his power and her degradation. It had fallen open, its contents slightly askew, a silent invitation on the cold, hard floor. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the world was silent, save for the blood pounding in Alara's ears, a frantic drumbeat against the canvas of the restaurant's stunned quiet. Time itself seemed to bend and warp around the small, discarded object on the floor. She did not feel the eyes of the other patrons, 100 pairs of curious, judgmental stares that dissected her humiliation. She did not hear the panicked, shallow breathing of the manager standing frozen a few feet away. Her entire universe had contracted to the space between her and the wallet. The cold of the polished marble seeped through the thin fabric of her uniform trousers as she slowly, deliberately knelt. It was not an act of submission, but one of reclamation. Her movements were fluid, devoid of the trembling that should have accompanied such a profound degradation. Inside her mind, the image of her father's face, slack and pale against a hospital pillow, flashed with blinding clarity. This indignity was not for her. It was for him. The leather of the wallet was cool and smooth beneath her fingertips, impossibly expensive, smelling faintly of cedar and something metallic, like ambition itself. She was not picking up a handout. She was recovering a weapon. As her fingers closed around the wallet, its weight felt substantial, not just with cards and currency, but with the sheer oppressive gravity of the man who had thrown it. It had fallen open, a dark leather butterfly pinned to the marble floor. Her eyes, trained to find the minute details in a Renaissance painting, to trace the lineage of an object through centuries of history, were drawn to a small, worn plastic sleeve tucked into one of the folds. It was out of place amidst the platinum credit cards and the crisp, large denomination bills. It was a space reserved for something personal, something of sentimental value. Tucked inside was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, its edges soft and frayed. On it, rendered in the clumsy, earnest strokes of a child's hand, was a drawing. It was a simple sparrow, perched on the gnarled branch of an old tree. Its head was tilted with a curious, lively energy, its small form a testament to a long-forgotten moment of quiet observation. It was a drawing she knew, as well as her own reflection. A cold electric shock jolted through her, a current of pure, unadulterated recognition that bypassed thought and went straight to her soul. Her eidetic memory did not just recall the image, it resurrected the entire world that surrounded it. Suddenly, she was a child again, sitting on the floor of her father's study, the scent of sawdust and old books in the air. She saw his large, gentle hands holding up his own copy of the drawing, the paper just as faded, the sparrow just as hopeful. He had told her the story 100 times. It was a memento from his own childhood, a summer spent in a forgotten, dusty town with his best friend. Two boys from families with nothing, who dreamed of building things that would touch the sky. They had sat under an old oak tree and drawn the same sparrow, a pact made in graphite and imagination. They promised each other they would build things that would last, things of beauty and integrity. Her father had kept his drawing as a reminder of that promise, a talisman of a friendship he believed was pure. Seeing its identical twin in the wallet of the man who had destroyed him was like watching two universes collide. The past and the present, the promise and the betrayal, all converged on that single, faded image. A profound and terrifying calm settled over her. The storm inside her did not cease. It froze, solidifying into a glacier of purpose. The heat of her humiliation was replaced by an arctic resolve. She rose to her feet, not with the hurried motion of an embarrassed servant, but with the slow, measured grace of a queen ascending her throne. The wallet was still in her hand, but she did not clutch it. She held it as one might hold a piece of evidence. The ambient noise of the restaurant, which had begun to creep back in whispers, died once more. Every person in that room was now transfixed, caught in the invisible, high-tension wire that stretched between the powerful billionaire and the insignificant waitress. She lifted her gaze from the wallet and met Marcus Thorne's eyes directly. For the first time all evening he was truly seeing her, and what he saw made the sneer on his face falter. Her expression was no longer one of professional placidity. It was a mask of serene, absolute certainty. The air crackled with anticipation. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the silent tectonic force of her revelation. When she spoke, her voice was not the one she used to ask about wine pairings or dessert choices. It was a different instrument entirely. It was low, clear, and carried across the silent room with the resonant clarity of a bell. There was no tremor of fear, no hint of anger. There was only the cold, hard weight of an undeniable truth. She held his gaze, a predator now facing a creature it had never imagined could fight back. "The sparrow on the west branch," she said, her words precise and cutting. "You drew this with my father, Daniel Vance, the summer you both promised to build things that last. He still has his." The name, Daniel Vance, struck Thorne like a physical blow. His face, which had been a canvas of arrogant disdain, seemed to crumble from within. The color drained from it, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor. His eyes, which had held only contempt, now widened with a flicker of something ancient and horrifying, a memory he had spent 30 years and billions of dollars to bury. The name of his childhood friend, a ghost from a life he had meticulously erased, spoken by a waitress in a black uniform, shattered his carefully constructed reality. Thorne's shock was a fleeting, terrifying thing, a momentary crack in his armor before the molten rage poured through. The exposure was unbearable. This girl, this nobody, had not just insulted him. She had excavated a piece of his soul he thought was long dead and displayed it for all to see. In front of his associate, in front of his peers, she had connected him to a past of poverty and promises. A past he had clawed his way out of through betrayal and ruthlessness. His composure, the bedrock of his power, fractured completely. A deep, guttural sound, something between a gasp and a roar, escaped his lips. His hands, which a moment ago had been gesturing with grand authority, now clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He was a king whose crown had been knocked from his head by a peasant, and the sheer, unadulterated fury of it consumed him. The carefully maintained atmosphere of Aurelia was incinerated by the heat of his wrath. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was a cornered animal, lashing out with primal, unrestrained violence. "Get her out of my sight," he bellowed, his voice cracking with the strain of his fury. He stabbed a trembling finger in Ilara's direction, his face a grotesque mask of blotchy, apoplectic red. The words were not a request, they were a command, an imperial decree from a man who was not accustomed to being disobeyed. Now, the manager, a man named Julian who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, flinched as if he had been struck. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he scrambled to obey, his own survival instincts overriding any sense of fairness or decency. He saw only the volcanic rage of his most important client, a man who could ruin his restaurant with a single phone call. The associate at Thorne's table looked on, his face a mixture of terror and confusion, trying to process the sudden, violent implosion of his powerful host. The other diners averted their eyes, pretending to be absorbed in their meals, yet every one of them was listening, savoring the raw, unexpected drama that had erupted in their gilded sanctuary. The spectacle of a powerful man losing control was a far more intoxicating delicacy than anything on the menu. Julian, the manager, grabbed Elara's arm, his grip surprisingly strong, his palms slick with nervous sweat. His face was pale, his eyes pleading with her to just go, to not make it any worse. He muttered apologies under his breath, words that meant nothing, empty platitudes offered up to the god of commerce. Elara did not resist. She allowed herself to be led away, her back straight, her head held high. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a scene from a movie. The walk from Thorne's table to the restaurant's exit was the longest of her life. She passed tables of silent, staring faces, their expressions a mixture of pity, curiosity, and a faint, cruel amusement. She was no longer an invisible servant. She was the star of a scandalous drama, a momentary diversion in their otherwise seamless lives. She didn't feel shame. She felt an almost overwhelming sense of clarity. The path ahead of her, which had been a long, dark tunnel of endless shifts and mounting bills, was now illuminated by the fire of Thorne's rage. He had not just fired her, he had declared war. The heavy oak door of Aurelia closed behind her with a soft, final click, shutting out the world of crystal chandeliers and whispered conspiracies. The night air of New York City hit her with the force of a physical shock. It was cool and damp, thick with the smells of street food and exhaust fumes, a stark, gritty contrast to the curated atmosphere she had just left. She stood on the pavement, the sounds of the city, the wail of a distant siren, the rumble of a passing subway, the cacophony of 1,000 conversations, rushing in to fill the silence. In her hand, she still clutched the wallet. Its expensive leather felt alien in this world of concrete and steel. She was jobless. The primary source of income for her father's care was gone. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. For a moment, the sheer, crushing weight of her reality pressed down, stealing the air from her lungs. How would she pay for the nurses, for the medicine? The fear was a physical entity, a monster with icy claws that gripped her heart. She took a deep, shuddering breath, then another. The panic receded, beaten back by the cold, hard certainty that had taken root in the restaurant. This was not the end. It was the beginning. She looked down at the wallet in her hand, this symbol of Thorne's arrogance, this catalyst for her own ruin. But it was no longer just a wallet. It was a key. It was the first piece of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was meant to solve. Marcus Thorne, in his blind, contemptuous rage, had made a fatal error. He had underestimated the invisible girl who poured his water. He had assumed she had no past, no memory, no power. He had thrown his history at her feet, and in doing so, had handed her the very weapon she needed to dismantle his entire world. The fear was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was now overlaid with something far more powerful, a clear, unwavering sense of purpose. The fight for her father's dignity was no longer a passive struggle of endurance. It had become an active campaign for justice. The bus ride home was a journey through a different city. The gleaming towers of Midtown, where men like Thorne decided the fates of thousands, gave way to the brick-faced walk-ups and neon-lit bodegas of her own neighborhood. The contrast had never felt so stark, so personal, The opulent prison of Aurelia and the humble sanctuary of her small apartment were two sides of a war she was now determined to win. She let herself into her cramped one-bedroom apartment, a space filled with books, sketches, and the lingering scent of her father's favorite pipe tobacco. It was a world away from the sterile perfection of the restaurant, a world built on love and memory, not on profit and loss. She walked over to her father's old drafting table, which took up a significant portion of the living room. Pinned to the cork board above it were photographs, notes, and in the very center, protected by a plastic sleeve identical to the one in Thorne's wallet, was another faded drawing of a sparrow on a branch. She took Thorne's wallet and carefully extracted the drawing. She laid it on the drafting table next to her father's copy. They were perfect twins, two halves of a single moment, a shared promise made 30 years ago. Looking at them side by side, the full scope of Thorne's betrayal settled upon her not as a wave of grief, but as a blueprint for action. He hadn't just ruined her father in a hostile takeover. His entire empire was likely built on a foundation of lies that began with this broken promise. Her mind, the academic mind trained in provenance, in tracing the history of an object to establish its true ownership, began to work. This was the greatest research project of her life. The objective was not to write a paper, but to rewrite history, to reclaim a stolen legacy. The rage she felt was no longer a hot, emotional fire. It had been forged into a cold, sharp instrument of intellectual warfare. She would not fight Thorne with his own weapons of money and power, for she had none. She would fight him with her own: truth, memory, and a daughter's unwavering love. Her first move was not one of passion, but of meticulous research. She spent the next 2 days in the cavernous reading room of the New York Public Library, the silence of the hall a welcome respite after the chaos of the restaurant. She didn't look for financial records or stock market data. She looked for stories. She pulled up microfiche archives of old newspapers and business journals from 30 years ago, searching for the first mention of Thorne Capital, for the story of Marcus Thorne's meteoric rise. Her eidetic memory scanned pages with astonishing speed, absorbing articles, names, and dates, building a mental map of the past. She remembered whispers from her father, fragmented stories of a brilliant design concept, a revolutionary approach to structural engineering he had developed in his early days, a design that was supposed to launch his own firm into the stratosphere. A design that had mysteriously vanished from his portfolio around the same time his friendship with Marcus Thorne had dissolved. The name kept appearing in the margins of her research, a ghost in the machine of Thorne's history: Arthur Finch. He was an investigative journalist from a now-defunct city paper, a bulldog known for his relentless pursuit of corporate corruption. 30 years ago, Finch had written a series of articles questioning the sudden, miraculous funding and success of Thorne's very first major project, the monolithic Thorne Tower that now dominated the city skyline. Finch had hinted at stolen intellectual property, at a shadowy origin story, but his investigation had hit a wall. He was publicly discredited by Thorne's high-powered legal team, his career ruined, and he had faded into obscurity. Alara felt a jolt of connection. Finch had seen the smoke, but he had never been able to find the fire. She, Alara Vance, was holding the match. Finding him would be her next step. He was the ally she needed, the mentor who could help her navigate the treacherous world she was about to enter. Locating a disgraced journalist who had dropped off the face of the earth for nearly 3 decades was a monumental task. There was no social media presence, no digital footprint. He had become an analog man in a digital world. Alara reverted to her skills as a historian. She cross-referenced old press club directories with voting registration records and property deeds, a painstaking process of elimination that took her from dusty library archives to the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the city's municipal building. After 3 days of relentless searching, she found him. Arthur Finch was living in a small, rent-controlled apartment in the Bronx, a world away from the corridors of power he once stalked. She stood outside his door, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. This was the point of no return. She took a breath, steadied her resolve, and knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway like the first stone cast in a revolution. The man who opened the door was older, his shoulders stooped with the weight of years and disappointment, but his eyes were still sharp, intelligent, and deeply skeptical. They were the eyes of a man who had been burned before and had no intention of letting it happen again. His apartment was a chaotic archive of a life spent chasing the truth, with yellowing newspapers stacked to the ceiling and old case files overflowing from cardboard boxes. The air smelled of stale coffee and paper. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. Elara didn't flinch. She met his weary gaze and spoke with the same calm precision she had used with Thorn. "My name is Elara Vance," she said. "Daniel Vance is my father. 30 years ago, you wrote a series of articles about Marcus Thorn and his first skyscraper. I believe I have the piece you were missing." She opened her folio and showed him the two drawings of the sparrow side by side. A flicker of something long dormant, the old fire of the hunt, ignited in Arthur Finch's eyes. He stared at the drawings, then back at her, and for the first time in a very long time he looked like a man who was ready to believe again. Arthur Finch's apartment was not just a home, it was a mausoleum dedicated to forgotten truths. Stacks of yellowed newspapers leaned against the walls like ancient, crumbling pillars, their headlines screaming of scandals long since buried by the relentless march of time and money. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper, stale coffee, and the faint metallic tang of a righteous anger that had been simmering on a low heat for 3 decades. Arthur himself seemed to be a part of the archive, a man whose posture had been bent by the weight of the stories he carried. He listened to Elara, his sharp eyes missing nothing, tracking the subtle shifts in her expression, the unwavering resolve in her voice. He had seen countless victims of corporate greed walk through his door over the years, their faces etched with desperation and a naive hope for justice. But this was different. Elara Vance did not come to him with just a story of pain. She came with a key, a tangible piece of the past that unlocked the very first door he had ever found slammed in his face. He saw not a victim but a weapon that had finally been unsheathed, and the old, familiar fire of the hunt, an ember he thought had long turned to ash, began to glow once more in the pit of his stomach. He poured them both a cup of black, bitter coffee in mugs that were stained with the ghosts of 1,000 previous investigations. He didn't offer her false hope or easy promises. Instead, he laid out the battlefield with the grim realism of a seasoned general. Marcus Thorn isn't just a man, Elara. He's an institution. He's a fortress, and his walls are built of the best lawyers money can buy. His moats are filled with NDAs, sealed court documents, and the terrified silence of anyone who ever tried to cross him. We are not just looking for a piece of paper. We are looking for a crack in a foundation that has been reinforced with billions of dollars and 30 years of calculated ruthlessness. People who knew him back then are either paid to be silent, or they're too scared to remember. The city itself has a vested interest in protecting him. His buildings pay taxes. His charities fund galas. His name is carved into the stone of libraries and hospital wings. To go after him is to go after a pillar of the city. He wanted her to understand the sheer scale of the Leviathan they were proposing to hunt, to see the full darkness of the water before she agreed to dive in. Elara met his cautionary gaze without a flicker of doubt. Her resolve was not born of naivete, but of a profound, unshakable love. She thought of her father, trapped in the silent prison of his own body, his brilliant mind a flickering candle in a storm. The man who had taught her about structural integrity, about the importance of a solid foundation, had been shattered by a man who built his entire life on a lie. She understood the risks. She understood the power they were confronting. But the fear of failure was nothing compared to the agony of inaction. "We will not be looking for one piece of paper," she responded, her voice calm and steady, a quiet force in the cluttered room. "We will be looking for the entire blueprint of his betrayal." My memory is the archive that he could never seal. He buried the evidence, but he forgot that some of it was stored in the minds of the people he destroyed. He can't shred a memory. Arthur Finch saw the truth in her eyes. This wasn't a quest for vengeance. It was a mission of reclamation. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The partnership was sealed. The war room was open for business. The next few weeks were a descent into the past, a painstaking archaeological dig through the sediment of 30 years. Arthur's living room became their command center, the walls disappearing behind a sprawling web of timelines, photographs, and city maps. Post-it notes of names, dates, and potential connections bloomed across every available surface, like a strange, investigative fungus. Ilara was the heart of the operation, her mind the central database. She would close her eyes and walk through the sunlit rooms of her father's old architectural firm, a building that had been bulldozed 2 decades ago. She recalled the names of his partners, the draftsmen bent over their tables, the receptionist who always had a bowl of lemon drops on her desk. She remembered fragments of overheard conversations, the titles of books on his shelves, the specific shade of blue he used for his preliminary sketches. Each memory, no matter how small, was a potential breadcrumb, a thread they could pull to see if it would unravel a piece of Thorne's carefully woven narrative. They were building a ghost of a company, resurrecting it in memory to find the evidence of its murder. Their days were spent in the hushed, dusty halls of the city's municipal archives, a bureaucratic labyrinth where the city's history was interred in endless rows of gray filing cabinets and cardboard boxes. The smell of decaying paper and binding glue was their constant companion. They sifted through mountains of public records, incorporation documents, property deeds, zoning applications, construction permits. Most of it was a desert of legal jargon and bureaucratic minutiae, a deliberate obfuscation designed to be impenetrable. They encountered their first major wall. Many of the key documents related to the construction of Thorne Tower were sealed, protected by a court order from a lawsuit settled decades ago. Another dead end came when they tried to track down her father's former business partner, only to discover he had died of a heart attack just 6 months after the hostile takeover, a man quite literally broken by the loss of his life's work. The silence of the dead, and the legally enforced silence of the city's records, formed a formidable barrier, a testament to the thoroughness with which Thorne had buried his past. The nights were a blur of phone calls and cross-referencing, fueled by endless cups of Arthur's terrible coffee. They tried to contact former employees of her father's firm, Vance and Sterling Architecture. Most of the numbers were disconnected. The few people they did reach were wary, their voices tight with a fear that had not faded with time. The moment Arthur mentioned the name Marcus Thorne, a wall of polite, unshakable forgetfulness would descend. They remembered Daniel Vance as a kind boss, a brilliant architect, a good man. But their memories of the firm's final days were hazy, indistinct, a trauma they had no desire to revisit. The message was clear. Marcus Thorne's shadow was long, and even after 30 years, people were afraid to stand in it. Ilara felt a growing frustration, a cold dread that perhaps Thorne had been too perfect in his crime, that he had erased every single trace, leaving them with nothing but the ghost of a promise captured in a child's drawing. The weight of her father's silent suffering pressed down on her, and for a moment the path forward seemed to dissolve into an impenetrable fog. The breakthrough came not from a document or a phone call, but from the depths of Ilara's own memory, a detail so small she had almost overlooked it. She was staring at a photograph of her father in his old office when her mind snagged on a face in the background. It was a young man with a thick mustache and kind eyes, bent over a drafting table, a T-square in his hand. She remembered his name, George Kowalski. He had been her father's lead draftsman, a quiet, meticulous man who had been with the firm from the very beginning. He had always smelled faintly of graphite and erasing gum, and he had once shown her how to draw a perfect circle without a compass. He was more than an employee. He was a friend, a man who shared her father's passion for creating beautiful, functional spaces. She remembered her father saying that George had a memory for details that rivaled his own. He was the keeper of the plans, the man who translated her father's visions into precise, technical drawings. Finding him became their singular obsession, their last, best hope. Tracking down George Kowalski was like searching for a single specific grain of sand on an endless beach. He had left the city after the firm collapsed, disappearing from the world of architecture altogether. There was no digital footprint, no online presence to follow. Arthur used his old-school journalistic skills, working his way through union records and change of address forms, a painstaking process that took them through a dozen false leads and dead ends. Finally, after a week of relentless searching, they found him. He was living in a small, quiet town in upstate New York, a place of sleepy main streets and wraparound porches. He was retired, a widower who spent his days tending his garden. When Ilara and Arthur arrived at his small, neatly kept house, he opened the door with the cautious, guarded expression of a man who was not used to visitors. His kind eyes were now framed by a web of wrinkles, and the once thick mustache was a soft, white shadow of its former self. When Ilara introduced herself, a flicker of recognition, followed swiftly by a deep, profound sadness, passed across George's face. He remembered her as a little girl with bright, curious eyes who would visit the office. He invited them in, his movements slow and deliberate, and they sat in a living room filled with framed photographs and the scent of lemon polish. At first he was hesitant to speak of the past. The collapse of Vance and Sterling was a wound that had never truly healed for him. He spoke of Daniel Vance with a reverence that brought tears to Ilara's eyes, describing him as a genius, a mentor, a man of unshakable integrity. But when Arthur brought up the name Marcus Thorne, a familiar fear clouded his eyes. He shook his head, insisting he couldn't help them, that it was all too long ago, that he didn't remember anything specific. He was a man who had built a quiet, peaceful life on the ruins of his former career, and he was terrified of anything that might threaten to demolish it a second time. Ilara knew that pressure would only make him retreat further into his shell of silence. She didn't appeal to his sense of justice or his anger. She appealed to his love for her father. She reached into her bag and pulled out not the sparrow drawings, but a small, leather-bound sketchbook of her father's. She opened it to a page filled with preliminary sketches for a public library he had designed, a project he had been immensely proud of. She pointed to the intricate cross-hatching, the elegant lines of the facade. "Do you remember this, George?" she asked softly. "Dad said you were the only one who could get the curvature of the main reading room right. He said you had hands that could think." She wasn't asking him to be a witness against a billionaire. She was asking him to remember the beauty they had created together, to honor the legacy of the man they had both admired. The carefully constructed walls around George's memory began to crumble. He reached out a trembling hand and traced the lines of the drawing, his eyes filling with a grief that was 30 years old. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek and fell onto the page. He remembered. He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He remembered everything. He told them about the project that was supposed to be the firm's masterpiece, a revolutionary skyscraper design that used a unique, biomimicking structural system inspired by the bone structure of a bird's wing. It was a design that was not only incredibly strong, but also elegant and energy efficient, years ahead of its time. Her father had been obsessed with it, pouring all of his genius and passion into the plans. And he had given the project a code name, a nod to the childhood promise he still cherished, the promise of building things that would last. He called it the Sparrow Project. The words hung in the air, a perfect, resonant chord of truth. Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. The sparrow wasn't just a memento, it was the symbol of the stolen dream itself. George's fear was now replaced by a quiet, determined anger. He told them that after the takeover, Thorne's men had been ruthless. They had confiscated every document, every drawing, every blueprint. They had legally gagged every employee with ironclad non-disclosure agreements. threatening financial ruin if they ever spoke a word about the firm's proprietary designs. But George, in a small act of defiant loyalty, had done something no one knew about. The preliminary plans for the Sparrow project, the early-stage conceptual drawings that contained the core of her father's revolutionary ideas, had not been stored at the main office. They were kept in an off-site, long-term archival storage facility, a place used for old projects and tax records. In the chaos of the takeover, the monthly rental bill for that specific unit had been overlooked. He wasn't sure if the documents would still be there after 3 decades, but he gave them the address of the facility and the unit number, a piece of information he had kept locked away in his memory like a sacred trust. The storage facility was a relic from another era, a sprawling, low-slung brick building in a forgotten industrial corner of Queens. It was a place where things went to be forgotten, a necropolis of old furniture, outdated electronics, and the paper ghosts of defunct businesses. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and damp concrete. Gaining access was the next hurdle. The facility was under new management, and the records from 30 years ago were a chaotic, undigitized mess. Arthur, leveraging his old press credentials and spinning a convincing story about a historical article on the city's changing industrial landscape, managed to talk a bored, overworked manager into giving them a temporary access pass to the archives section. He claimed they were looking for photographs of old manufacturing equipment. It was a long shot, a gamble based on a 30-year-old memory, and a journalist's gift for deception, but it was the only shot they had. They found the unit in a dimly lit subterranean corridor, the air cold and still. The roll-up metal door was rusted at the edges, the lock seized with age. It took Arthur several minutes of wrestling with a pair of bolt cutters he had brought along to finally break it open. The door groaned in protest as they rolled it up, revealing a small, dark space packed from floor to ceiling with decaying cardboard boxes. A thick blanket of dust covered everything, and the beam from Alara's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene that had been sealed off from the world for 3 decades. It felt like opening a pharaoh's tomb. They began the painstaking process of searching, carefully opening one fragile, water-stained box after another. Most contained old accounting ledgers and client correspondence, the mundane paperwork of a long-dead business. The hours ticked by. The hope that had propelled them there began to fade, replaced by the grim possibility that the documents had been cleared out or destroyed by time and neglect. Just as despair was beginning to set in, tucked away in a corner behind a stack of rotting boxes, Alara's flashlight beam landed on a long, cylindrical cardboard tube, sealed with yellowed tape. It was different from the other boxes, a container designed for one specific purpose, to protect architectural drawings. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, hopeful rhythm. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, wiping away a thick layer of grime. On the side, written in her father's familiar, elegant script, were 2 words, Project Sparrow. It was real. It had survived. They carried the tube back to the main corridor, where the light was better, their movements filled with a reverent awe. This was it. The culmination of their search, the physical proof of a 30-year-old crime. The air itself seemed to crackle with the significance of the moment. Alara carefully broke the brittle tape and slid the contents out onto the dusty concrete floor. A roll of thick, heavy paper, yellowed with age, unfurled with a dry, rustling sound. It was a set of preliminary architectural plans, rendered in her father's distinctive hand. There were elevation drawings, structural diagrams, and detailed notes in the margins. As her eyes scanned the page, her eidetic memory ignited, connecting these images with the thousands of articles and public records she had absorbed over the past few weeks. She saw it all, the unique, cantilevered design, the innovative load-bearing core, the elegant sweep of the facade. It was the DNA of Thorn Tower, the unmistakable architectural signature of the building that had made Marcus Thorn a titan. It was all there, born from her father's mind, captured on this aging paper, The truth had not been erased, it had only been sleeping. Then she saw it. In the bottom right-hand corner of the main blueprint, next to her father's initials, DV, was a small, stylized sketch. It was no bigger than a thumbnail, a tiny detail that anyone else might have missed. But to Alara, it was as bright and clear as a supernova. It was a perfect, tiny drawing of a sparrow in flight, its wings outstretched, a symbol of the soaring ambition and natural elegance that had inspired the entire design. This was the smoking gun, the irrefutable link between the man, the promise, and the crime. A wave of emotion, so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over her. It was grief, it was rage, but above all, it was a profound, cleansing sense of vindication. Tears streamed down her face, not of sadness, but of triumph. She was holding her father's stolen soul in her hands, and she finally had the power to give it back to him. Back in Arthur's apartment, the atmosphere had transformed from one of desperate investigation to one of quiet, lethal preparation. They unrolled the original Sparrow Project blueprints on the floor. Next to them, they placed a set of the official, publicly filed construction plans for Thorn Tower. The comparison was devastating. It was not just a similarity in concept, it was a direct copy. Entire sections were identical, the core structural innovations lifted verbatim from her father's original work. Thorn had not just been inspired by his old friend's design, he had stolen it, lock, stock, and barrel, commissioning his own architects to make superficial cosmetic changes while keeping the revolutionary heart of the design intact. He had built his empire on the foundation of a grand theft, a betrayal so profound it was almost poetic. They now had the motive, the method, and the undeniable proof. Their victory was short-lived, interrupted by a frantic call to Arthur from one of his few remaining contacts, a low-level archivist at a city newspaper. The source was spooked. He whispered that there were whispers in the financial world, a sudden, intense interest in the origins of Thorn Capital. Thorn himself had gone on the warpath, his lawyers sending out threatening letters to anyone even tangentially connected to his early days. Shredding trucks had been seen making late-night visits to Thorn Capital headquarters. The Leviathan was bleeding, and it had started to thrash in the water. Thorn didn't know who was coming for him or what they had, but he sensed a threat, and he was moving to cauterize the 30-year-old wound. Alara and Arthur realized their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. They couldn't fight him in the courts. He would bury them in legal motions until their evidence was discredited and their resources were gone. They had to strike once, publicly, and with such overwhelming force that he would have no way to recover. The final piece of the plan fell into place when Arthur saw an announcement in the society pages of the newspaper. Thorn Capital was hosting its 30th anniversary gala, a lavish black-tie affair celebrating 3 decades of Marcus Thorn's supposed genius. The event was the pinnacle of the New York social and financial calendar, a night where Thorn would be lauded by politicians, celebrated by his peers, and showered with praise by the media. And the venue for this grand celebration of his success? The magnificent, soaring atrium of Thorn Tower, the very monument to his original sin. The irony was so perfect, so complete, it felt like an act of fate. It was the perfect stage, a room full of the most powerful and influential people in the world, with every major news outlet present. It was a trap of his own making, a gilded cage of his own ego. Arthur looked at Alara, a grim, determined smile on his face. He still had his old press pass. They had their way in. The checkmate was in sight. The atrium of Thorn Tower was a cathedral built to the god of capital. Soaring walls of glass stretched 30 stories high, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline that Marcus Thorn had conquered, a glittering tapestry of lights laid at his feet. The air, chilled to a precise temperature, hummed with the quiet, confident murmur of the city's most powerful figures. Women in gowns that cost as much as a family car drifted through the space like exotic birds, their laughter like the chiming of delicate glass bells. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos stood in tight clusters, their conversations shaping the flow of global markets between sips of vintage champagne. A string quartet played Vivaldi from a discreetly placed balcony, their music a sophisticated, almost subliminal soundtrack to the evening's performance of Power. Everything was designed to overwhelm the senses, to communicate a message of absolute, unassailable success. It was the grandest stage in New York, a monument to Marcus Thorne's vision, and tonight he was its star, basking in the adulation of a world he believed he owned. At the center of it all, a massive screen displayed a rotating gallery of his achievements. Skyscrapers, magazine covers, philanthropic donations, a carefully curated history of a man who had built an empire from nothing. Marcus Thorne stood at a podium, bathed in the warm golden glow of a spotlight. He was in his element, a king addressing his court. His speech was a masterpiece of corporate self-mythology, a narrative of grit, vision, and relentless ambition. He spoke of the Thorne philosophy, of disrupting paradigms, and, quote, leveraging synergy, a string of empty buzzwords that the crowd nonetheless drank in with reverent attention. He painted himself as a modern-day titan, a builder of cities, a visionary who saw the future and bent it to his will. He made a passing, almost dismissive reference to his humble beginnings, framing it not as a source of empathy but as a testament to his own singular genius, proof that he had transcended the ordinary limitations of lesser men. As he spoke, Ilara Vance moved through the periphery of the crowd, a ghost in a simple, elegant dark dress, her presence a quiet, deliberate counterpoint to the room's ostentatious display. She felt a strange, profound stillness within her. The fury that had sustained her for weeks had cooled and sharpened into a diamond point of focus. Her heart did not race. Her hands did not tremble. She was an instrument of history, a vessel for a truth that had waited 30 years to be spoken. With Arthur Finch acting as a subtle shield, his old press pass a talisman that parted the sea of security guards, Ilara made her way toward a small, unmanned technician's booth near the stage. The plan was audacious, a high-wire act with no safety net. Arthur had spent the last 2 days calling in every favor he had left from his long-forgotten career, convincing a cynical, underpaid event technician that a rival firm was planning a surprise tribute for Thorne, a video that needed to be patched into the main feed at a specific moment. It was a lie built on a foundation of corporate vanity, a story so plausible in this world of sycophantic gestures that it was never questioned. Ilara watched Thorne on the stage, his face projected onto the giant screen behind him, a mask of smug satisfaction. He was celebrating the anniversary of his first great victory, the theft that had launched his entire empire. He was standing in the very building that was the tombstone of her father's dream, and in his arrogance, he had invited the world to bear witness to his own execution. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost suffocating. Thorne was reaching the crescendo of his speech, his voice booming with false humility. So as I look back on these 30 years, I don't just see a company. I see a legacy built on integrity, on hard work, and on the unwavering belief that a bold vision can reshape the world. That was the cue. In the booth, Arthur gave a curt nod. The technician, bored and oblivious, pressed a button. On the massive screen behind Thorne, the slick corporate montage of his achievements vanished. It was replaced by a single stark image, a faded, yellowed piece of paper, showing a child's clumsy, earnest drawing of a sparrow perched on a branch. A collective gasp, a ripple of confusion, moved through the crowd. Thorne, momentarily blinded by the stage lights, hadn't noticed the change. He continued, his voice resonating with theatrical pride. A legacy that will stand for 100 years. Then, a second image appeared on the screen, materializing next to the first. It was another drawing, identical in every detail, its paper just as faded, its sparrow just as hopeful. The two halves of a broken promise, magnified 30 feet high for the entire world to see. Elara stepped from the shadows and walked calmly toward the stage. A microphone had been left on a small lectern, and she moved toward it with an unhurried, deliberate grace. The crowd, now utterly silent, parted for her. Security guards started to move, but they were hesitant, confused by her composure, unsure if this was part of the program. Thorn finally turned, his self-congratulatory smile freezing on his face as he saw the images on the screen. His mind struggled to process the impossible sight, the ghost of his past resurrected in this temple of his success. Then he saw Elara, and a flicker of recognition, of pure, animal terror, flashed in his eyes. She reached the microphone. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, carrying to every corner of the silent, cavernous atrium. That legacy, she said, her words cutting through the stunned silence, was not built on a bold vision. It was built on a stolen dream. My father, Daniel Vance, drew one of those sparrows 30 years ago. The other was drawn by his best friend, a boy who promised to build things with him. A boy named Marcus Thorn. The name, her father's name, hung in the air, an indictment that needed no further explanation. The images on the screen changed again. The sparrow drawings were replaced by a new set of documents, displayed side by side in damning comparison. On the left, the elegant hand-drawn blueprints of the Sparrow project, signed with the initials DV. On the right, the official construction plans for Thorn Tower. Elara used a small laser pointer, her hand as steady as a surgeon's, to trace the identical lines, the unique structural elements, the revolutionary core design that was the heart of both buildings. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The evidence spoke for itself, a silent, irrefutable testimony to a grand theft. She exposed him not with rage, but with the cold, precise language of a historian presenting her findings. She laid out the truth with meticulous, devastating clarity. Marcus Thorn did not create a legacy, she concluded, her voice resonating with the quiet power of absolute certainty. He stole one. And he built this tower, this company, this entire life, on the ruins of a good man he betrayed. A wave of murmurs and shocked whispers erupted from the crowd, the sound of a reputation turning to ash. The flashes of cameras began to strobe, a frantic, hungry lightning storm capturing the fall of a titan. Marcus Thorn stood frozen on the stage, a statue of disbelief. The world he had so carefully constructed, the narrative of his own genius, had been dismantled in less than 2 minutes by a girl he had dismissed as less than nothing. His face was a canvas of collapsing emotions. The smug confidence drained away, replaced by a ghastly pale shock. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The teleprompter still scrolled with the triumphant end of his speech, a cruel, mocking reminder of the reality that had just been incinerated. He looked out at the sea of faces, his peers, his investors, the media, and saw not admiration, but a mixture of pity, contempt, and morbid curiosity. He was no longer a king, he was a spectacle. A primal, guttural roar of pure, impotent rage finally tore from his throat. "Liar!" he screamed, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. "It's all lies!" But his denial was drowned out by the rising clamor of reporters shouting questions, the sound of his world coming apart at the seams. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly unsteady, a man hollowed out from the inside, his empire of lies collapsing upon him in a silent, suffocating avalanche. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Elara finally exposed the truth. The downfall was swift and absolute. The story was a media supernova. The tale of the billionaire fraud and the waitress who brought him down with a childhood drawing was too perfect, too cathartic to ignore. Thorn Capital's stock plummeted into a nosedive, from which it would never recover. His board of directors, a collection of ruthless men who valued profit above all else, abandoned him without a second thought, ousting him in an emergency meeting before the sun had even risen the next day. Lawsuits, like sharks sensing blood in the water, began to circle. Ilara, representing her father's estate, filed a multi-billion-dollar suit for intellectual property theft, a case built on the irrefutable evidence of the original blueprints. Thorne's life became a blur of depositions and legal battles, his fortune bleeding away into the hands of lawyers. But the financial ruin was secondary to the public humiliation. He became a pariah, a walking symbol of corporate greed and betrayal. The name he had spent a lifetime building into a monument of power was now a punchline, a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms he could no longer enter. He was left with nothing but the hollow echo of his own arrogance, and the ghost of a promise he had broken 30 years before. Ilara did not revel in his destruction. Her victory was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet and profound. With the initial settlement from the lawsuit, she was able to move her father to a state-of-the-art neurological care facility, a place of sunlight, gentle care, and quiet dignity. One afternoon, she sat by his bedside, reading him the headlines that detailed Thorne's spectacular fall. He could not speak, but, as she read, a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, and for the first time in years his eyes held a flicker of clear, lucid understanding. He squeezed her hand, a small, weak gesture that contained a universe of love and gratitude. That was her real victory. It was not the money or the fame. It was this moment, this quiet connection, this restoration of a stolen peace. She had not only avenged her father, she had honored him, proving that the integrity he had instilled in her was a force more powerful than any fortune built on lies. The world had finally been set right. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. It was from a prestigious, globally respected architectural firm, a company known for its ethical practices and its commitment to artistic integrity. They had been following her story, not for its sensationalism, but for the incredible display of research, courage, and unwavering loyalty it represented. They were not offering her a job. They were offering her a purpose. They had created a new position, Director of the Vance Legacy Foundation, a division of their company dedicated to preserving the work of under-recognized architects and funding projects that prioritized ethical design and community benefit. They wanted her to lead it, to use her unique mind and her unshakable moral compass to protect the dreams of others, to ensure that no other Daniel Vance would ever have their legacy stolen. She would be a guardian of blueprints, a historian of integrity, a builder of a better world. Ilara Vance stood on the balcony of her new office, overlooking the city. It was a different view from the one inside Thorne Tower. It was not a view of conquest, but one of connection. A vibrant, living tapestry of millions of lives and dreams. She had walked through the fire of humiliation, and emerged not burned, but forged. Her journey had taken her from the hallowed halls of academia to the invisible servitude of a restaurant, and finally, to this place of purpose and power. She had learned that true strength was not in the ability to dominate, but in the courage to defend. She was no longer a waitress, no longer just a daughter seeking justice. She was a guardian of legacies, her eidetic memory no longer a party trick or a tool for academic papers, but a shield to protect the beautiful, fragile things that men like Marcus Thorne would so carelessly destroy. She had reclaimed her father's honor, and in doing so she had finally, truly found her own. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.